Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Zoe Grotefors, and I'm the Manager of Research and Strategic Insights with Government Business Council. We are the research division of Government Executive Media Group. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's viewcast, Making the Grade in Digital Government. Events like these wouldn't be possible without the support of our underwriters, so I'd just like to take a moment to recognize the exclusive underwriter of today's event, Acquia. Acquia is a digital agency that helps government organizations at all levels define and implement their digital strategies and innovate to transform the business of government. Acquia works with government agencies including Department of Justice, FEMA, and the Federal Judicial Center, as well as the City of Los Angeles and the states of New York and Georgia. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our two speakers. Today, I'm here with Gwen Costin from the General Services Administration and Chris Comparato from Acquia to discuss how government agencies are progressing in digital delivery. First, a few words about Gwen. Gwen serves as the Chief of Digital at the General Services Administration. This virtual center is being stood up to catalyze and accelerate agency efforts implementing the White House Federal Digital Strategy by focusing on information and data, customer experience, and sharing resources to help agencies do more with less. She's worked on providing services through technology for the past 15 years in government technology, homeland security, education, and healthcare. Gwen, we're so excited to have you on the program today.
I'm glad to be here.
And seated next to Gwen is Chris Comparato. As the Senior Vice President of Customer Solutions, Chris is responsible for Acquia's customer-facing strategy, operations, and delivery. He's a key member of the senior executive team, with a focus on working with customers in key markets to facilitate the adoption of innovative open source and open cloud technology products and solutions. These help cost-effectively optimize digital strategies and change the way information and services are delivered. Chris, thanks so much to you for being here as well.
Happy to be here.
So today, Gwen, Chris, and I are going to cover a lot of ground on digital government. We're really going to do four things. First, we'll discuss why digital platforms are so important to government, and we'll talk about where agencies are adopting these tools. We'll look at the 4 digital government strategy areas, and we'll talk about which of these are moving the farthest ahead and which of them maybe need some more improvement. We'll talk about some case studies, who's doing this well, and maybe what other agencies can learn from these groups, what they can do in their own agencies. In doing so, we'll touch on open data, open source solutions, and agile acquisition as parts of key digital strategy goals. Finally, we'll talk about the challenges that agencies face and that they must overcome in order to improve digital delivery. And in doing so, we'll also touch on the digital playbook and how it can be used to craft and implement effective digital strategies. Finally, toward the very end of this viewcast, we'll turn it over to our viewers for your questions and comments. You can submit these at any time by tweeting at us during the discussion using the hashtag Digitalgov. That's all one word. So with that, just a tiny bit more introduction. I first want to tell you about the survey that Acquia and GBC conducted this year. We'll be referencing it throughout the event. So we did this study to gain more insight into the digital government efforts overall and the 4 strategy areas in particular. It was launched back in June 2014 to a random sample of Government Executive, NextGov, and Defense One subscribers. And we had 357 people respond from across government. We had 30 different agencies involved in defense and civilian sectors, and they represented many job functions. And just so we're all clear, there was a very senior group that we talked to. 68% of our respondents were at the GS-13 level or above. As I said, I'll be highlighting some of these results today, but the full report is also available below the video player on your viewing platform. There's also an issue brief that we authored on the same subject. But with that, we'll talk about what we really came here for, and that's the discussion. So Gwen and Chris, our first question is pretty broad, but I think it really sets the scene for the rest of the discussion. Can you, each of you, tell us in your own words, why are digital platforms so important for government?
I think the real important idea regarding digital platforms is just the concept of platforms in general. And so just to take a second to talk about what a platform, and what we're talking about when we're saying platforms, is really taking a look at a space where things can be built on. And when we talk about platforms, and the real big one of the big advantages of platforms is it helps in terms of standardization It also helps in taking away some of the repetitive work that agencies have to do in order to move forward with their digital space. And when I think about platforms, I think about not just in terms of technology, but there are other types of platforms. And so it could be, so in our group at GSA, we also have a number of platforms that we offer in addition to technology. We have a platform of training around digital government, our Digital Government University. And we see that as a platform because we provide the services around the training processes, and all agencies can use that to provide training to the broader digital community. The other area, though, we're talking about in terms of platforms is we also have another platform that we're running called sitesusa.gov, which is a platform, a content management system that any agency can use, and all they have to worry about is their content. They don't have to worry about the structure, they don't have to worry about the security or the privacy issues. And so the idea around platforms are a few. One is that they provide some efficiencies, but secondly, they also provide some standardization. And one of the key parts of the digital strategy is we're not doing this to do digital strategy. We're doing this to improve government, and we're doing this to improve government services. And that level of consistency so the public knows what to expect from government is really important.
That's great. Thanks, Gwen. When we look at digital, we feel that digital has really changed everything. And what I like to do is similar to Gwen, look at platform as in the people, the processes, and the technology. Right. And I really think that we're in an era of transformation that we haven't seen previously. Obviously, there was the mainframe to client server, the client server to web. We're now in an era where things like open source and cloud and also agile come into play. So why is it important in government? For us, we believe that there's strong cost savings. We think there's effort savings. We also think that there's an ability to leverage innovation that's out there. So when you look at cloud specifically, there are platforms that contain innovation and reusable patterns that we've seen in other businesses. So we think that's extremely important. The other thing that I'll mention is I think it's important because it's important for the government to set an example. The digital playbook, as an example, really sets sort of a manifesto as an example for others to learn from. So I also think it's important for the government to adopt digital and platforms in general to set an example for others.
Yeah, I think both of you have touched on two key drivers of government going digital. Gwen, you said it's not just doing digital to do digital, it's to really achieve something. Chris mentioning the costs. And we actually asked in our survey, what are the drivers of digital efforts in your department or agency? And what we actually found was that the top reason was actually compliance with mandates. I'd love to get your feedback on that. But in addition, we did see cost savings as the second most important driver. And we had 8 different drivers listed. Encouraging innovation actually came out at the bottom of that list, various things in between. But I'd love to get your take on these findings. Do they make sense, or is something not quite add up there?
Well, from my point of view, I think it makes good sense. There was a digital strategy, and it had very specific requirements for agencies, and so that was driving. And that was done on purpose. One of the things that is really important is because of the digital strategy and because of the compliance, every agency was able to get their feet wet in this digital space. And that was specifically around opening up data and making APIs available, really looking at the mobile delivery of information and services. It was around, requiring a governance process for agencies. And so by doing this and by complying with it, people are moving forward. And the thing is, you don't even realize what you've learned in that process. So we see, so it's not a surprise to me that compliance is a number one piece on it. Number 2 being efficiencies and cost savings. Again, we're always trying to do more with less. And so that if we can achieve some cost savings, and that also helps us to justify budget. So it's a really good argument for justification of budget. The fact that innovation is at the end, I think, also talks a little bit around incentives. And to be innovative is really to be risk-taking. And in some ways, a mandate allowed agencies to take risks that they wouldn't have been able to take otherwise. And so, as I said, it's in if you really look at it, it's a very positive thing because the strategy is doing and driving agencies to take that risk and giving them the space to take that risk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. I think there's a few forces at work, and one may think that the forces of cost containment and compliance are at odds with innovation, but I actually think that the two forces, like Gwen mentioned, can play off of each other through incentives. Innovation doesn't have to be an all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You could start small, and there's many ways to start small across people, process, and technology so that it's not cost heavy and you're incented to actually start something different. So I think the two forces can actually play off of each other quite nicely, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of reasons to be pursuing digital government, not just because you're told to, but you actually want to achieve something as well. But our survey, we really looked at it as kind of a progress report. So 2 years after the digital government strategy has been released back in May 2012, we asked federal leaders to grade their agency's digital efforts, and we got an average grade of C+. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, is that about right? Clearly that's an average, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe there's some above and below. But what do you guys think? Where's government right now?
I think, I see it kind of a path more so than a grading scale, And so if we take a look at the digital space, this week or next week will be the 10-year anniversary of the first web policies that came out in the federal space 10 years ago. We were talking about that, and one of the things that we said is like, oh, how many things have changed, and we're talking about it, and I said, wait, let me just ask you one thing. Did you know that 10 years ago, there was no Wi-Fi? Everybody stopped, because we think about Wi-Fi and having this ubiquitous on-ness is the norm. But the whole idea about having information available on the cloud, et cetera. So this is a trajectory that we're working on. So I just want to, say that. And I always joke around because people, in looking at technology projects, are really looking at fully formed technology processes. If you look at Amazon, when Amazon started in the 1990s, it was not beautiful. It was difficult, and they had to really convince people to pay, go online and pay for things. Now we see Amazon as this big conglomerate that is providing cloud services, that is a huge seller, is making their selling engine available, and the warehouse is available as an engine. That took 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so 2 years in from the digital strategy, I think that we're in good shape. But I actually want us to back out because we're really from, during the Clinton administration in terms of the reinvention of government, the Bush administration with the 2024 Quicksilver projects to the digital strategy. And you can trace a line through that where government is moving in that space. So C, A, D, whatever, it's the trajectory is going in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd comment that the findings weren't surprising. I think C+ is a moving target. And to Gwen's point, we talk often about a digital journey. Mm-hmm. Many of our customers are on a digital journey, and that journey has many different maturity levels that customers go through. You could look at sort of even on the process front, the maturity level of starting with big waterfall projects, now people doing Agile. That's a journey. You could look at independent websites not speaking to each other. Now we've got integrated digital experiences to the tablet and smartphone. So there's an enormous amount of transformation, and I'd argue that there's a digital maturity model that exemplifies the journey and the path that different agencies can take. And depending on where they are in that path, they may be a C+, they may be an A-, but it's a journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can talk about progress overall, but we can also look into some of these detail-oriented areas within the digital government strategy as well. So as you guys know probably in the audience as well, there's really 4 target areas that we talk about with digital government strategy. And I just want to touch on the 4 of those really briefly, and then we'll go into each of them in a bit more detail with the panelists. So the digital government strategy is built on 4 overarching principles. The first is information-centric. This is really referring to managing data and content in ways that can be shared, utilized, and presented in useful ways, really making data meaningful. Includes things like open data, making web APIs the new default, for example. The second area and one that we'll spend a lot of time on today because it's actually an area with a lot of room for improvement, I think, is shared platforms, talking about things like shared services, sharing standards across agencies, and encouraging collaboration. The third area that we talk about is being customer-centric. And so that's things like using websites, mobile apps, and other delivery modes to really improve the service to your customers, whether they're internal, your agency employees, or whoever your agency serves, be it citizens, businesses, other levels of government. And the final one, which I don't think needs a lot of explanation, is security and privacy. So knowing that those are the four areas, and they're kind of the outline of the next part of our talk, we asked our respondents which of these areas have seen the most progress. And we saw that security and privacy was where they really felt the best. Curious to hear from you guys rather. Why do you think that is? Why is it that this is perceived to be so much farther ahead than maybe some of the other areas?
So I'll start. I think security and privacy is mission critical. So if you look at the information that flows through the government and our agencies, I think of DHS as an example. It's mission critical information. So security and privacy are out front. For example, the ability to defend against a cyber attack. But there's got to be infrastructure and security within that, and initiatives that drive privacy and security across the board. FedRAMP being one example of one of those initiatives to make sure that infrastructure is secure. But I'd probably defer to Gwen on DHS because DHS is a prime example of someone who's really adopted security and privacy as a very important initiative. And I think that's why you see some of the scores so high in that area.
Yeah, I also would offer that security and privacy is, there's more concrete type actions you can take. I mean, you want to harden things, you want to make sure that you're protecting information, that you're protecting data. So I think that there's a lot of pieces on that. And from a traditional IT perspective, I think a lot of the people who responded to your survey were traditional IT people, that's the bread and butter. So that really doesn't surprise me as much in terms of that area where we're seeing the most progress. From an overall perspective. But I would offer, one of the things I get to do is I get to work with innovators all across government. And that's makes my job amazing. Not everybody should be jealous. Because I get to hear the stories and the activities and the focuses of agencies and sub-agencies and sub-sub-agencies who are really trying to make a difference in this digital space. And one of the things we've really seen that one of the digital government strategy is top-down, but a lot of the work is really coming from the very bottom up. And so really meeting those two pieces together is where we're going to, and we're working in that space. But there's a lot of innovation that's going on within agencies. The whole agencies were working on mobile way before the digital strategy. And we saw some really, really interesting applications about mobile apps and mobile websites from smaller agencies where they were trying something out. There's this really great app that was developed called Get Mako, where people could identify and tag Mako sharks. The folks that did it out of NOAA spent $45 in terms of making the app. At that time, Google had an app maker that they used. But they were able to meet a mission space where sports fishermen would go and they'd see the tag Mako, but then they could actually identify how the fish were swimming around. But that was done really early, really on the cheap. But that experience is shared with other agencies, show that you can actually create an app, that it can have a specific purpose, and that you can actually do it within government. And so I think that looking at the innovation space, it's really coming from a lot of the program offices on the ground, and then working its way up.
Mm-hmm. An example outside of the federal government, which is interested in the Mako shark example, triggered something. But if you look at the New York Metro Transit Authority, they're really an information hub, and they've built a platform that supports serving information in a secured way out to different constituents, so that, for instance, you can get alerts when either trains aren't on time or there's an emergency. But now people have built 77 mobile applications on top of that information hub, which is really, really interesting in terms of innovation, because people access those APIs, but now they're benefiting from the innovation that's taken place to say, hey, we could use that information in this type of way for this type of mobile app. Really interesting.
Yeah, I think you guys have segued nicely into the areas where maybe there's more work to be done, but there's certainly these groups that are farther ahead than others. I think what we've been talking about a little bit here is maybe tied to the information-centric or customer-centric buckets of digital government. And I just want to share a couple survey findings from each of those with the audience today. So when we talked about information-centric in our survey, we're really talking a lot about open data. That was just maybe the focus of what we chose to look at. But we asked respondents to tell us how their agency's data is stored and managed. We saw that 42% of them said that it's available in standard formats. None of these numbers come to majorities, by the way. We have 40% saying it's searchable, 21% telling us that it's easily shareable, and just 19% telling us that it's accessible on any web-enabled device. So we sort of get the sense from this that a lot of agencies may not be storing and sharing data in ways that are the most useful. You've given us a couple examples, but are there any other innovative ways that you're seeing agencies either storing, sharing, or making this data available?
I want to talk a little bit about those numbers that you had too, because one of the things it doesn't show is it doesn't show the change over time. And so if we looked 2 years ago, rather than having those numbers of 40% of people having data available in a common format, it could have been 10% or 20%. So I think that, we don't really see, and again, everything's snapshot in time, so we don't really see the progress on that. So, is the glass half full or is it half empty? I'm going to go with half full. I'm an optimist anyway. So I really see that, we're really looking at that. When we look at a tool like Digitalgov, which has been, has been around for the past, 6 years or so, or 5 years, that was originally a place where data was stored. But as our thinking has evolved and as we are learning more, I mean, you're talking about an agile process, we are trying out different pieces and then making pivots based upon it. Right now, Data.gov serves as a catalog, and there are 134,000 data sets that are cataloged there. And right now, they're all using a common metadata set so that they're all surfaceable. And so the thing is that, of course, you improve discovery in this. But also what we're doing is we're creating standards around this. This really goes to the platform thing. And so we're really seeing this evolution so that this is more usable and it's more, and there's more standards, which is going to help in the future other types of developers and innovators and entrepreneurs build on top of these resources. So I really think that there's really a lot of change going forward in there. And I think if we looked at a delta on it, which, we don't have something to make one up, I think that the trajectory is going up.
Yeah, I think I came out of the search space before Acquia, so I get pretty passionate about data. But I think Gwen's exactly right. It's sort of a continuum, and with more massive amounts of data that are different types, users' expectations for how they filter and sort and search, the bar gets higher and higher. I think the other important element of sort of the information-centric view is the content delivery itself. So how do you actually access that information at the point in time that a citizen needs that information? I think that's an interesting space to probe. I was doing some research in prep for this, and over almost 50% of a individual's connected time is over a smartphone or a tablet. So now we're talking about not just accessing the information, but accessing it cross-channel over different devices and making sure that those user experiences are compelling to the user to access that information at the time that they need it. So I think that's another continuum to look at, which is not just how is it stored and sorted and how can you search it, but then how can you access that very quickly, because consumers and citizens are now pretty much on demand. We want that information at our fingertips extremely quickly.
Mm-hmm. I want to give this is an example that I just, it makes me cry. It's so exciting. Although that might tell you something about me, but a beautiful example of just this information coming together really has to do with Digitalgov Search, which is available to all agencies and is used on hundreds of websites. And what the Digitalgov Search team did was working with SEC. The problem was that SEC has a website and there's information on their website, but they do a lot of stuff in the regulatory space. And so if people were looking for something about a regulation, the regulation information was on the Federal Register, which is a different site. The Federal Register, though, has an API available. So what the digital search team did was use that API and was able to integrate it with the search results. So if you're on the SEC site and you're searching about something and there's something pending in the Federal Register, it comes up first. What that does is, in a just-in-time moment, allows the public or whoever's searching for it to say, this is something that's pending right now, I can go comment. And so it's really opening up government in a different way. And so that's the use of API, it's the integration of it with search on a current website, and it's crossing a number of different agencies. And so that is an example of the space we're going to be into, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, there was another example this week, very similar. Department of Justice had a press release on Tuesday where they released a number of digital services, and two of them were very important APIs. So they made the APIs available, and those APIs allow you to search news and jobs and other information across Justice.gov. So just making that API available is now an innovation that allows people to build off of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one common thread that's come through in a lot of these examples is thinking about the customer experience as well. So it's not just the data, but it's actually how does that person experience working with this data or working with this tool. And that was another section of our survey. So we talked about mobile apps, whether they're providing quality services through mobile apps to their customers inside of their agency, the internal employee, or outside of the agency to those external customers or citizens. We found that between 30 and 37% of people say yes to those two, respectively. And we saw that social media fared a little bit better. We have about half of our respondents saying that they use social media effectively to engage customers. So I like those app examples a lot because I think they tie to really what we were looking at. But in addition to that, one thing that we looked at, which we haven't yet touched on today, is the user satisfaction and just how that's measured. To me, that seems like an important component of putting all this money and effort into digital services. So are there is this alarming to you maybe that we saw 44% of people saying that they don't believe that they measure user satisfaction? And if that is alarming to you, why? And maybe if not alarming, who do you see that's doing that well, and maybe we shouldn't worry about this so much?
Well, I think that one of the cross-agency priority goals from the White House, the CAP goal, has specifically to do around customer experience. So what we're seeing is an increased attention to that. Whereas I think that in the past it was seen kind of as a nice to have, it really is being pushed to the fore. So if we're going to look at this, if we did the same question next year, I would expect that we're going to see numbers raising on that. But one of the things we found in the digital strategy, that was one of the drivers, was really looking at the customer experience. And a lot of agencies were not only not getting customer data, but a lot of them weren't even using performance data in terms of how, what was their level of traffic. Or if they were just reporting numbers. And so they really weren't doing things actionable. And so as part of the digital strategy, our team was tasked with helping to solve that problem for agencies, and we set up the Digital Analytics Program, which has a couple of different aspects to it. One is really looking at the creation and the establishment of a set of common measures around both performance in terms of visits and traffic, as well as around customer experience and satisfaction. The next area was providing tools for agencies to use so they could actually measure it, because a lot of the agencies didn't have it, or they didn't have it in a consistent way, or they had it in a way that was just really in their own silo and they weren't able to go across different, even within their own agency. And then the third aspect of it, which is important, is really that training and support, and that making, taking those numbers, which may or may not be interesting, and creating some actionable tasks from that. And so since the digital strategy, we have 3,200 agencies that are using the same set of performance gathering tools on their website. So they could actually see within their agency. The Department of Justice has a look all the way up and down in terms of what is happening on their websites and what those levels of traffic are. We can see across agencies what's important and what's not. and also as part of that, we actually are building a set of community and information so that people are helping each other out in terms of understanding these metrics. We are going to be implementing in this next year customer service, customer experience tools, so we actually have at least a high-level assessment on that to start solving those problems as well. But part of it is, you have to stand up in order to walk. And so in some ways, we're pushing ourselves to our feet still on that in terms of getting these tools established. But we also are, we're driving the plane while we're building it. We're flying the plane while we're building it. And so we're going to continue to iterate these processes. But and with the support of this CAP goal, I think it's really going to push it forward.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add is, to be a passenger on that plane, the expectations are really high, right?
Yeah.
So users expect, highly performant digital experiences across different devices. They expect it to scale during events. They expect information on demand, real time. And to have that type of analytics initiative is really important because it's standardizing how users can expect digital experiences to act.
Mm-hmm. But we have to also be careful too, because one of the things we're really going to do is try to educate people too,
Yeah.
so that if people can say, oh, people are coming to this website and leaving right away, so that the website isn't any good. But depending upon what the purpose of that tool is, that actually might be exactly the type of behavior you want to see.
Get in and get out.
Get in and get out. Whereas other
Yeah.
ones where you want them to have a longer time on site, it could be that they're confused. So these are actually markers to find out some other information on it, and so you can start. I love data, so I'll go running down that rabbit hole in a heartbeat to try to find out what's going on. But it's also really looking at understanding those tools better and not making incorrect assumptions around it, because data can be dangerous too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so just to go briefly to our last area of actually not very briefly, I think this is one that needs the most improvement as told by our survey respondents. It's the shared platform area. We've talked a little bit about standardizing, about agencies working together on certain initiatives dealing with digital delivery. But we had some statistics here that maybe weren't great, but then yes, maybe we're just getting started. We see less than half of our respondents telling us that their agencies are opting for open source technology rather than closed source or proprietary technologies. We have 39% telling us that they do use a common or shared content management system with other agencies. And this is something that's explicit in the digital strategy, directly encouraging federal government to do more to enable the sharing of data and make content more accessible. So we're just curious, I think, to hear a little bit about how you guys see the shared platform area. What might be responsible for these numbers not being quite as high as we might like at this point? Or are they where we want them to be?
Well, I think where we want them to be is I think we want people to be sharing more, and we want things more open. So I'm going to say no. The numbers aren't where we want them
Exactly.
to be. But I think that the big challenge really is around incentives, and it's been my word of the year for the past 2 or 3 years. So it might be my word of the decade. I'm not sure. But I think it's really important to understand kind of what are incenting agencies to do more sharing, and how do they how does leveraging other people's work really provide a positive effect? And so I think in the open source space, there's a level of newness around it in terms of, there are stories from some agencies who aren't interested in buying open source because it just doesn't cost enough, because they can't evaluate it and they can't value it, and so they don't really understand it. So there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of really great work that's been done in the acquisition space to really move that forward. And I'm not really expert in that space, but so I think that there's that. There's also the idea that open source is scary because it's open, and people really don't understand that aspect of it. But the other part of it too is that open source is also not a panacea, and I think that a lot of people are looking at well, it's open source, it's not proprietary, but you are actually coding it to your organization, and so the shared platform really helps us to stop making these multiple one-off of open source implementations, because that's as costly as doing it, and that locks your data in just as much. So one of the areas we've been looking at is really going we call it up the stack. And so a lot of times we're looking at kind of what the delivery mechanism is. So it's on a mobile device, it's on your telephone, it's on your on your desktop, or it's on your big TV. But how does it get there in all these different ways? And how do we start looking at the information that we're presenting in a more granular way and moving up the stack so that we're making that information more available? So we went to the devices and we're looking at APIs because that's the way we deliver it. Then we have to go up from the APIs to say, where's the data, where's it being stored, and how is it being organized? So in response to that, we have a group of really smart people across government working on the development of simplified open content standards. So there's a lot of work that's being done in the data space, which I think is really great and important. But how do we say, what are the common elements of an article? Mm-hmm. And yes, it's been done. There are a lot of and we've been working with schema.org and others, but really looking at a simplified model so that agencies could start building those content models into their content management systems, and then that's going to open up the data so that they're going to be able to share across agencies and do some syndication. HHS has been doing a really nice job in terms of an open syndication model that they've been working across, but CDC has been using it specifically to provide information, up-to-date health information to their state and local partners, health information folks. And so that model we are working with and sharing with other agencies as well, but then looking at what those content elements are across so that we're really going to the top of that stack, which is what we're putting in.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, by the way. So I think obviously open platform, open source, that's my other passion outside of search. And obviously, with all of our customers, we default to the open source way as well as the platform and cloud. As I mentioned earlier, it's a journey. It's definitely a journey. And we see some customers who may leverage Drupal and open source and start by building out APIs, but then we see other customers, take FEMA for example. FEMA started with defaulting to open source and moving to the cloud, but they started with a Drupal distribution, something called Open Public, which was already a framework that had been battle tested as a base to start with. Then they could build off of that within the agency and then share that distribution and platform with others. The other thing that I'll mention as a pro to the open source way is the ability to contribute back. So as you work with open source, let's say Drupal in our example, you could actually build modules that allow you to contribute back and give back more to the open source platform in a way that allows other agencies and others to leverage that module based on what you did that was innovative. So we think that's really a very interesting method because that's highly innovative, cost efficient, and starts people down that digital journey of giving back more, not just taking it and using it, but enhancing it as they go. We think that model is really going to be a business model and an open source model that works when we talk about cross-agency facilitation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another thing that I think might be good to touch on just to give some how-tos to people out in the audience today, but if they are thinking about shared platforms and how to maybe kickstart these initiatives or get people to listen to them about these things, if there's maybe not the incentive to do it necessarily, what are some of those benefits that an agency itself could expect to see from open source or from shared content management, any of these shared platforms really? And then what could the government overall benefit from this?
Yeah, so I'll start. There's many benefits, which I mentioned earlier. One is obviously the cost element of it, which is to streamline costs and do something that's very cost efficient. But the other is there's other things around open source that, when combined with open source, really create a compelling methodology to how you approach projects. We're big believers that integrated digital experiences done through an agile method where you're iterating quickly based on users' needs, then combined with cloud versus on-premise, create a space that allows you to be very innovative but not at big costs, and you could start small. And we've seen that as an example time and time again where you could start small, ground up, and actually start to build some solutions that then become compelling business cases for others to leverage once you get it to a point of maturity where people can actually reuse it and say, hey, I'm going to take what you did over here and I'm going to leverage that, donate back into it, and then grow it from there. So I think that's a very compelling way to start relatively small but get moving.
And there are I'm going to put in a plug, unabashed plug for one of the platforms that we have, which is digitalgov.gov. That's digitalgov.gov. And we are collecting stories and business cases across agencies. And so when you talk about innovation is happening or it's not happening, we see it all the time. And we really see a lot of exciting areas where agencies are able to leverage each other's work. I think that one of the spaces that we're really interested in are examples of code actually being reused, because there are so many agencies that are contributing to open source, but there's kind of almost a contract between the contribution of that code and the maintenance of that code and its reuse. And so one of the things we're working on is looking at ways to help agencies feel more comfortable about reusing code. And I think that you're exactly right in terms of starting small. So we have a code catalog, mobile code catalog, that we've been collecting code pieces on. And one of the things is we weren't seeing people using it. So our next step was to break it down into smaller pieces. Because maybe somebody didn't want the open source version of the White House mobile app, but there were pieces of it that they wanted. So we're starting to mark those pieces up. And there was actually a piece of code, a very simple piece of code that HHS had worked on developing that helped in the display of tables in a responsive model. And a responsive design is where you have a website that actually can dynamically resize itself depending upon the size of your device. So it goes from the desktop to a mobile device fairly easily. But things like tables don't work out so well. So we were really happy that in this little model, this one little piece was able to be reused. But again, like I was talking about before, it's that experience of reusing it. It's doing it and realizing that the world did not collapse, nothing's on fire, you don't have locusts and frogs, that you actually are able to succeed doing that in these small areas. I think is really critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think these are all really great examples, and we're actually getting quite close to the Q&A portion of today's event. So just as a reminder, if you do have questions that you have not yet asked, you can send them to us through Twitter using the hashtag DigitalGov. That's all one word. And so my last couple questions for you guys are really focused on the challenges. We asked directly in our survey, what are the biggest challenges to implementing digital efforts? And of our 357 respondents, the things that came out on top are maybe surprising or maybe not surprising at all. Cost, skills gaps within the agency, and legacy systems were identified as the major obstacles. I'd love your input on those findings and also how we can overcome some of these biggest challenges.
I think that we could almost just say cost is a given. I mean, every time there's a question, what's a barrier? I think people almost always say cost or budget.
Yes.
And I think that, but I would like to actually relate those some ways to legacy systems, because one of the things, and former CIO Steve Van Rokel had mentioned this many times, is that we're really making an investment in maintaining the legacy systems, and we're not, and so 80% of our money in IT is going to maintenance.
Yeah.
And so that means that, or 90%, so we have a very little bit of innovation. And so part of the digital strategy and part of the tech stack process was to help to rejigger that a little bit, so you could release some money from these legacy costs and do some more innovation. I think that's critical. The other thing I want to mention about legacy systems, though, is that we also have to be more creative in how we look at these legacy systems, because taking them down to the studs and rebuilding them is huge and costly, and we have myriad examples of how that has failed in government for the past 10 years for sure, and I'm sure 20 years and up. But if we take a look at what we're trying to accomplish, there are things that folks can be thinking about in terms of middleware layer and looking at the API layer in an important way, so that is there a way to get the data out or into these legacy systems using a web service, and so that you could actually maintain that, but actually modernize the front end, make it more available. So that system might be closed, but you can open it up using an API. There's a great example, not from government, but that I loved from ESPN, because they have tons of different data sets that they use, and some of them are about football and hockey, some of them about the teams as well as the players. But they're actually able to make validate that data and standardize that data in the API layer. And so if it's first name, last name in this data set, and it's name over here, they're actually resolving it on the API layer. And if we think more creatively about how to do that and get really smart people, because I think the skills gap is not unimportant there, we could actually move forward.
It's good. I was going to say the same thing, which is in some cases we can wall off legacy systems, tap into it, grab the content, only the content that we need, and then leverage it across a shared service model and then grow from there. Because then we don't really need to replace it. We're maintaining it at hopefully a thinner cost, but then we're putting our dollars towards innovation in the middleware to allow us to access that content for other solutions and other services. And that's a method that's very beneficial.
Yeah, I think these examples that we've been talking through are really useful. And one thing that I want to touch on as kind of our last discussion topic before we go to Q&A is this digital strategy playbook. So this is really a best practice guide. It really gives examples from across both public and private sector on how agencies can be doing these things that we want them to do in digital government. I'd love to hear from you guys. Do you see this digital playbook to be really a game changer? If so, has it had any change yet, or are we too early right now, and what do you expect we might see?
I'm really excited about it because for a couple of reasons. One, early on we were talking about incentives, and I think that this is a way for agencies and people who are doing innovations to point to and say, I want, here's the playbook, let's work from this playbook and let's make these changes. Because one of the things when we talk to folks within agencies that they talk about is the difficulty in creating change or getting the buy-in of their leadership. Or the leadership might be bought in, but there's a clay layer in between the innovators and the leadership, and it's really hard to move it. So having this playbook, I think, is very valuable on it. And I think the other thing what's really interesting about the playbook too, there's 13 different plays, and I think they're really kind of in 3 areas. One is really focusing on the customer and the end user as the most important, and that's like play number 1, and there's a number of others of them. The second one is really around infrastructure, about how do we buy and how do we hire within government, and I think there's some plays around that. And then the other piece is really about kind of really good technical practices. And so I think when we look at those are exactly what we should be looking at, and those are the ways that we should be focusing. The game is changing, whether we want it to change or not, so is this a game changer or what? Government is in an ecosystem that is very fast-moving, that is in a position that we have to meet customer expectations. We need to meet citizen expectations, and I think the playbook's going to be helpful.
I mean, I think it's a key success factor for how you do digital and start along this journey. If you think about it, in reading those 13 plays, it shows you where you could start. And you don't have to do all 13. You could actually start in one spot and say, okay, how am I going to get better in this space? Maybe it's testing, maybe it's the open source way, maybe it's leveraging a modern technology stack. But I think it gives people sort of a manifesto of how it's done well and right, and then where can I start related to that playbook. The other interesting thing in the playbook are the questions that it asks, because the questions force you to think as a technology leader, as a user, as a developer, and I think that exercise alone of reading those questions are invaluable to any team or any program or any executive, because it's a very good manifesto to how to go down this journey and start this path.
Well, thank you both for your feedback on the playbook. I think it's an exciting thing that everyone's thinking about when we think about digital delivery right now. And at this point, I think it's really time for Q&A. I've asked Gwen and Chris enough questions, and we've gotten a lot of great questions in from Twitter. So I'd like to start with our first one here. Either Gwen or Chris, do either of you have advice for the digital champions out there, the people who are trying to implement change inside of their agency? Maybe they're not quite at the top levels, maybe they're somewhere within, but how can these people get buy-in?
I think that's a great question, and I took one of those stupid BuzzFeed quizzes on Facebook yesterday.
And what were you?
And so what was my key personality trait? and it came up that I'm courageous. And I think part of it, and not that I am courageous or whatever, but I just thought it was interesting in terms of this question, though. I think part of it is to be courageous and to identify the problems that your organization is facing, and then key this digital stuff to that.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the CAP goal I mentioned before about customer experience and the improvement of that, it is not a digital play, but it is totally supported, and digital is totally required in order to succeed in that space. So where are those areas where, if you're not getting buy-in, key it to what your boss is looking to do, and show them where you can make that success, and be of heart.
Yeah, the things that came to mind for me when thinking about that question are really, if I'm the product owner or the product manager and I'm selling my idea and I'm selling my solution or initiative, I think where I was going to go was really connect with your user. Really, really understand your constituents, your citizens, your stakeholders, and really get an understanding of their requirements and how those requirements are changing over time. And I think then make your argument from there, because I think as we become more user-centric and more enabled at a citizen level, understanding and connecting with your end user is key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually have a fairly similar question talking about buy-in again, but this is more when we're talking about sharing services or platforms across agencies. And if you're an agency interested in doing that, maybe you've identified a partner or another group within your larger department, this person wants to know, since we talk about shared platform services where capabilities are shared across agencies, what can individual agencies do to kickstart these types of initiatives with other agencies? Do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, in some ways I'm not exactly sure where they are in that process, but one of the things I would say is that there are great examples of communities that exist already, whether they're data communities, whether, we actually sponsor communities around user experience, around data, around mobile, around social media.
Open source.
And that there are ways, and when I was plugging my platform before, there's a number of communities listed on digitalgov.gov, which are ways to make that connect. But if you have an agency that you're interested in working with, and if you have some challenges in that, there are ways, you have to make those relationships. The one thing about government that I learned from the private sector coming into government was that nothing gets done unless there's a relationship. It's the same wherever you are, and so even though there's a lot of rules, those relationships are really critical. And it's finding those people and then working your way up and doing that networking to find out, because there may be an MOU, there may be an IAA, there interagency agreement, there may be other types of limits or different flavors of money that have to be worked through, but it really is starting those discussions to begin with.
Yeah, I was going to say, we see a lot of the connecting of dots between agencies and in the government in general through the open source community itself. Right. When you have such a large open source project like Drupal, you often have events, and you see the connections through contributors, people that actually contribute modules to Drupal. And those connections get made at different events, and it's sort of for the better good and to give back more. So that's where we see a lot of those connections. So if there are those types of opportunities to connect through those events, I'd encourage people to do that.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do in our office is we really work on making those connections. There's one agency that was working with our mobile community of practice, and it turned out there were 5 different parts of that agency working on 5 different mobile products, and they had no idea who each other were. And so we were able to link them together with each other, and they then were able to share information within their agency as well as in a broader space. So I really think that we're at a great time in terms of social and the social media, the different tools that we have, meetups, ways to connect with people on Twitter or Facebook, and through emails. Pick up the phone, send somebody an email, and get your questions answered.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, this next question is a bit different. I think Gwen may have touched on this a little bit earlier. This person would like to know, what are your thoughts on the resistance of some agencies and leaders to embrace digital or open source or open cloud technologies? I think earlier someone mentioned it could be scary, but are there more things that we're seeing, and why?
I think that there are a lot. First of all, it's, it's like not all leaders. Hashtag not all leaders. Not all leaders are scared about it, and there are some really amazing people who are really moving forward rapidly in digital space and making things happen. So I want to really be clear about that, and in some ways that's how things are happening. And I think that in other spaces, you're going to have a wide range of people. So always is trying to figure out what is the motivation for them. So that some people may be scared, some people may be nearing retirement, and it's not worth them making this investment and knowing about it. Some people may just be unfamiliar with the technology, and whether that's scary or not, that they just really don't know what it is. I think that moving forward, we're going to have more competencies of leadership around technology. So just like a leader right now needs to know about personnel, they need to know about budgeting, they need to know about contracting and managing projects and programs. Technology is a basic skill set that needs to be developed among the leadership.
Yeah, and I'd argue, working with your key stakeholders and your key partners to sort of navigate that path if you're nervous or inexperienced is critical, because others have sort of blazed trails ahead of you. So learning from your peers that have blazed trails in certain ways is invaluable as you start along that journey. The other thing is having something like the digital playbook is also invaluable, because that tells you certain areas to look at that foster some thoughts about where can I start, where can I go down that path if I'm a little bit nervous to start, let's say, with a modern technology stack. What are the questions I should be asking my leaders to say, okay, have you guys thought about this or that? Teach me, give me feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then one other thing I'd like to add too is that most small businesses fail. Many of the ideas that we have in government, they're like small business ideas, and we're trying to push them forward, and a lot of them fail. They don't get the traction they need. That doesn't mean it was a waste of time, though. It doesn't mean you didn't learn anything. It doesn't mean that your whole unit. And so success is not just launching.
That's right.
Success is learning. And so part of it is, when people get discouraged, like, I can't, the people ahead of me are a bunch of Luddites, they don't know what they're doing. You're still learning, you're still pushing forward, and you're learning how to deal with Luddites. You're learning how to make things happen. And if it doesn't go, that's fine. I mean, when I was at Homeland Security, we had actually done a proof of concept on blogging. I wanted the secretary to blog. This was 7, 8 years ago. And it just wasn't happening. But we did a proof of concept. I was ready to go. And then we had a new person that came in public affairs, wanted to do some blogging. I was able to be up in 6 weeks, because we already had done all the work already, and I didn't give up. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of it is to get things ready for when those opportunities, and so don't be discouraged, because you're learning.
Mm-hmm. And our last question that I think we have time for today is a little bit more abstract. This person would like to know, do you see any common traits or attributes of agencies or leaders that are succeeding in implementing effective digital services?
I'd say the ones that are willing to take some risk and willing to put themselves out there and start down the path. I think that would be one common trait, which is, hey, I'm going to break some ice and stick my neck out there and start something. And to Gwen's point, it may pass or fail, but that's okay. I'm going to learn from it, and then we're going to iterate off of that. The other thing is the concept of iteration or rapid prototyping is invaluable, because you're not going into a long cycle to figure out whether it's going to be successful or not. You're going a few weeks in to figure out whether that path is going to be a good path or a bad path. So I'd say that the ones that have been successful have probably iterated, they've probably failed, they've stuck their neck out there a bit, and they've proven where success lies on that journey.
And real quickly, I think the other thing that I would say is these are people who actually have a broader view of what government is and what it can do. And so it's not just a narrow view of my agency and what my mission is, which is important, and that's what we're paid to do, is focus on our mission. But it's really, how do we see this in a holistic way? How do we see it from the point of view of the human beings that we're serving and serving them? And I think that's another attribute, is that really that bigger picture.
All right, well, unfortunately, it looks like we're now out of time, but I just want to thank Gwen and Chris so much for being here and contributing your perspectives today. We really, really do appreciate your participation. And thank you to everyone in the audience as well. This viewcast will remain online for the next 3 months if you'd like to view the event again or share it with your colleagues. We'll see you next time. Thank you from Government Executive.